Have you ever felt that strange mix of excitement and fear when something unexpected happens? Something that completely changes the way you see a person. That's exactly what happens in today's story. This isn't just a typical roommate experience. What starts as an innocent college arrangement soon turns into something much more complicated, intimate, and unexpected. Meet our protagonist, a young woman, ready to start her sophomore year of college. Out and proud of her identity, she keeps her personal life private, only sharing it with the people she trusts most. She's never had an easy time with relationships, but that's all about to change. You'll learn how life can surprise you when you least expect it, and how the boundaries you set with others sometimes get blurred in the most unexpected ways. Enter Emily, her new roommate. Emily is straight, and from the outside, it seems like nothing more than a simple arrangement between two college girls. At first, their interactions are polite, maybe even a little distant. They don't have much in common, and they're both just trying to get through their busy schedules. But as the days go by, things start to shift in ways neither of them anticipated. What happens when you live with someone who starts to become more than just a roommate? What happens when your feelings start to change? You'll witness how their friendship evolves, how they each navigate their own personal struggles, and how things start to get complicated in the most unexpected ways. By the end of this video, you'll understand the emotional roller coaster that comes with living closely with someone who challenges everything you thought you knew about love, friendship, and identity. This story isn't just about lust, it's about real feelings, deep connections, and the courage it takes to confront emotions you weren't prepared for. So, sit back, grab some popcorn, and let this story take you on an emotional journey. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The weeks passed, and the space between the two roommates gradually began to shrink. What started as polite exchanges and awkward silences began to feel like something more, something comfortable. Slowly, the tension between them loosened as they spent more time together. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just quiet evenings, shared dinners, and an unspoken understanding that they could both breathe a little easier in each other's presence. Emily had a way of laughing at the little things, making their late-night study sessions feel less like a chore and more like moments of connection. In those early days, the protagonist found herself noticing Emily more. It wasn't anything glaring, just a quiet appreciation for how easy it was to talk to her, how natural it felt to have her around. They talked about everything and nothing, family, school, their plans for the future. They both had their secrets, but in that shared space, there was an unspoken trust. Emily was more than just a roommate, she was becoming a friend, someone the protagonist could rely on. But of course, there was more to it than that. Beneath the growing friendship, something else was happening, a shift the protagonist didn't want to acknowledge at first. A lingering glance, a smile that lasted a second too long. It wasn't just friendship, it was something more complicated, something she didn't quite understand yet. Every time Emily leaned a little closer, laughed a little louder, the protagonist felt something stir deep inside, a feeling she hadn't quite figured out how to name. It wasn't just physical, it wasn't about being attracted to her. It was about something more. Something deeper. She couldn't explain it, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to. There was a comfort in keeping it unspoken. She could tell herself it was just a phase, that it would pass once they were comfortable with each other. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just a passing moment. She was starting to care about Emily in a way that went beyond friendship, and that was dangerous. As time went on, their routines became intertwined. They had their rhythms, study sessions together, quick chats over coffee, even weekend trips to grab groceries. The little things became their foundation. The protagonist learned more about Emily than she'd ever expected. Emily had this kind of energy, a way of making even the most ordinary tasks feel special. She would dance around the apartment to some old pop song, dragging the protagonist into it with her until they were both laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. But there were moments when Emily's attention seemed to shift. She would catch herself lingering on the protagonist's words, her eyes softening when they shared something personal. In those moments, it wasn't just the fun of friendship, it was something else. The protagonist started noticing the way Emily's touch lingered on her arm when they were talking, the way she leaned in just a little too close when they were sitting on the couch together. It was subtle, but it was there. And it made the protagonist's heart race. Each time this happened, the protagonist would pull back, retreating into herself. She didn't know how to navigate these new emotions. Emily was straight, she wasn't supposed to feel this way, to want something more. The protagonist convinced herself it was just the closeness of their friendship, that the lines between the two of them were getting too blurry because they spent so much time together. She kept telling herself that, even as her feelings grew harder to ignore. But it wasn't just the protagonist who was struggling. Emily, too, seemed to be grappling with something. There were moments when she'd seem distant, lost in thought, as if trying to make sense of what was happening between them. The protagonist could see it in the way Emily would look at her sometimes. There was curiosity in those glances, a kind of hesitation mixed with something else. Something that made the protagonist wonder if maybe, just maybe, Emily was starting to feel it too. And yet, neither of them said a word about it. They continued their routines, pretending that everything was fine, that the connection between them was just a fluke. But every touch, every shared laugh, every quiet evening together made it harder to deny. The lines were already being crossed, even if neither of them was ready to acknowledge it. It wasn't long before the lines between friendship and something more grew even fuzzier. The small moments that once felt innocent began to carry weight. The protagonist couldn't ignore how Emily's smile seemed to linger longer, or how her touch would be just a little more intentional when passing by. It wasn't always obvious, just subtle things that no one else would notice, but to the protagonist, they were like electric shocks running through her body. Every time Emily's fingers brushed hers, a jolt of warmth would travel through her, and she would have to remind herself to breathe. They spent more time together now, studying late into the night, watching movies, or sharing dinner after their classes. Their routines were seamless, and in the comfort of their shared space, everything felt natural. But there was always a silent tension between them. It wasn't just the usual tension that comes from being around someone you're becoming close to, it was something deeper, more loaded. The protagonist could feel the heat between them, a magnetic pull that neither could ignore. One evening, after a particularly long day of studying, they decided to unwind with a movie. As they sat on the couch, their shoulders brushed together, and for a moment, neither of them moved away. The protagonist could feel her pulse racing, her heart thumping in her chest, and she prayed Emily couldn't hear it. There was something in the air that night, something thick and unspoken. It wasn't just the tiredness from their long day. There was an undeniable tension hanging between them, like they were both aware of it but pretending it didn't exist. When the movie ended, Emily didn't get up to leave. Instead, she shifted closer, and the protagonist's breath hitched. They sat there in silence, the space between them filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Then, out of nowhere, Emily broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, "I think we've been spending a lot of time together." The protagonist nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Yeah, I guess we have." Emily's gaze didn't meet hers right away, but when she did, there was something in her eyes that sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if we, I don't know, weren't just roommates?" The question hung in the air between them like an unsaid truth, and for a moment the protagonist's heart skipped. She had never expected Emily to bring it up, not like this. "I mean," Emily continued, "it's just, sometimes, I feel like we're more than that, don't you think?" The protagonist swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. The words she wanted to say were stuck, tangled in her chest. She had to keep reminding herself that Emily was straight, that this was just a fleeting moment of curiosity, of temporary confusion. But as she looked at Emily's face, so close to hers, so open and vulnerable, she couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just a question anymore. This was a moment of connection that neither of them could easily shake off. Before she could say anything, Emily reached out, brushing her fingers across the back of the protagonist's hand. It was gentle, a soft touch, but it sent a spark of heat up her arm. For a brief second, the protagonist thought she might burst, but she held back. She didn't want to ruin this moment, but she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. Her heart raced as she looked into Emily's eyes, searching for something, anything, that could tell her whether Emily felt what she was feeling. "Do you?" Emily began, but the words faltered, and the silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. "I don't know," the protagonist admitted softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't think it was something I could feel. But lately, it's hard to ignore." Emily didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her hand still resting lightly on the protagonist. And in that silence, everything changed. The walls that had been so carefully built between them, the boundaries they had set to keep things simple and safe, were slowly starting to crumble. The protagonist wasn't sure what came next. She wasn't sure what this moment meant, or where it would lead. But in that moment, she realized that it was impossible to go back to the way things were. They had crossed some invisible line, and neither of them could undo it. What had started as a simple friendship was now something much more complicated, something that neither of them could fully control or predict. The evening ended quietly, with no grand declarations or promises. They simply said goodnight, as they had so many times before. But this time, something felt different. The protagonist lay awake long into the night, her mind racing with what Emily had said, what she had touched upon. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in ways she wasn't ready for, and that made her heart race even more. It was a Thursday evening when everything finally shifted. The tension between them had been building for weeks, but neither of them had dared to confront it directly. That was until that night. After a small party with friends from school, the protagonist and Emily found themselves walking home together, the cool night air pressing in around them as they talked about the chaos of the evening. Laughter filled the space between them, a comforting sound that had always been their safety net. But tonight, there was something different, something electric that neither of them could ignore. As they arrived back at their apartment, the familiar quiet of their shared space felt oddly charged. The protagonist could feel it, that pulse in the air, the way the walls seemed to be closing in. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the weight of everything they hadn't said, but there was a kind of recklessness in the way they both moved. Emily kicked off her shoes and dropped her bag on the floor, but instead of retreating to her room like usual, she lingered in the living room. The protagonist wasn't sure what to say. The tension between them had always been so delicate, fragile. But tonight, it felt almost unbearable, like it was pushing them to do something they hadn't planned on. "Hey," Emily said, her voice low, hesitant, but unmistakably filled with curiosity. "Do you want to talk? I mean, I don't know about everything that's been happening." The words hit the protagonist like a punch to the gut. The moment she had been avoiding was here, right in front of her. She had thought about it so many times, but now that the conversation was happening, it felt almost impossible to handle. "I don't know what's going on," the protagonist admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to deal with it." Emily took a step closer, her eyes searching the protagonist's face for answers. There was no hiding from it now. They were both standing on the edge of something neither of them could fully comprehend. Before either of them could speak again, the silence between them was broken by the faint sound of their heartbeats, almost in sync. It was too much, too close, too real. And in that instant, Emily closed the gap between them. Without thinking, without hesitation, she reached up and cupped the protagonist's face, her touch soft but insistent. The protagonist froze, unsure of how to respond, her body trembling. Emily's touch felt like fire on her skin, like an invitation she wasn't sure she could accept. But she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Every part of her wanted to stay, to see where this moment would lead. Her breath caught in her throat as Emily leaned in, their faces inches apart. And then, it happened. Emily kissed her. It wasn't a slow, tentative kiss, but something more urgent, more desperate. It was as if all the things they had left unsaid were suddenly pouring out through their lips. The protagonist's hands instinctively found their way to Emily's waist, pulling her closer, feeling the heat of her body against hers. It was raw, unfiltered, a collision of everything they had been holding back. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world outside their little apartment ceased to exist. There was only the rush of their hearts, the frantic pressure of lips and hands, the shared breath between them. Every ounce of self-control they had been clinging to slipped away in that kiss. But as quickly as it had begun, Emily pulled back. Her eyes were wide with shock, disbelief even, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The protagonist, too, was caught in the whirlwind of what had just happened. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, taking a step back. Her voice was shaky, unsure of what to make of it all. "I didn't mean," but the protagonist didn't want to hear it. The words felt too familiar, too rehearsed. She couldn't stand the idea of going back to pretending it never happened. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand gently stopping Emily from pulling away. "No," the protagonist said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Don't apologize. I don't want you to." They stood there, inches apart, the space between them filled with the weight of everything they hadn't yet acknowledged. Emily's hand hovered in the air for a moment, then slowly, tentatively, she reached out and placed it on the protagonist's shoulder. "I don't know what this means," Emily said quietly, her voice vulnerable. "But, I don't regret it." The protagonist's heart skipped. It was the first time Emily had acknowledged the possibility of something between them, something real. And in that moment, it felt like the world had shifted once again. "You don't have to," the protagonist whispered, her thumb brushing lightly over Emily's wrist. "I don't know what it means either, but I think we're both in this now." The words hung between them, more of an admission than a question. Neither of them had the answers, but for the first time, they were no longer pretending that nothing had changed. They were standing on the edge of something uncertain, something terrifying, but also something undeniably real. As the night stretched on, the silence between them was filled with a new understanding. They didn't have to have it all figured out right then. What mattered was that, for the first time, they were both willing to face it together. You won't believe how one unexpected person turned her whole world upside down. She was young, lost in the quiet routines of a life that felt like it was passing her by. Her days were all the same, quiet, uneventful, and painfully lonely. But everything began to change the moment her mother's friends started showing up more often. What began as small talk in the kitchen slowly turned into something deeper, something no one saw coming. In this video, we'll uncover a story that's rarely told, an intense emotional journey between a young woman and someone she never imagined would matter so much. You'll see how an ordinary life can twist into something unforgettable, how love can bloom in the most unexpected corners, and how one person's presence can awaken feelings buried deep inside. Stay with us until the end to witness the turning points, the heartbreaks, and the quiet moments that speak louder than words. This isn't just a story of connection, it's a story about discovering who you are through someone else's eyes. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you powerful, faceless stories that feel real. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new release. Now let's begin. The young woman's routine hadn't changed much. She still lived in the same small house with her mother, still spent most of her time alone. But things felt different now. Her mother's friend had started coming around more often. At first, it was just for tea or an occasional dinner. But then, those visits began to stretch longer, sometimes staying until late in the evening, talking about everything from childhood memories to life's challenges. She wasn't sure why, but every time her mother's friend was there, she felt alive. There was something calming about the way she spoke, something grounding about the way she made her feel seen. There was no pretending, no small talk, just real, raw conversations. The young woman started looking forward to these moments. As her mother got lost in her own world of work and obligations, the woman found herself turning to her mother's friend for something her mother could no longer give her, attention. One afternoon, her mother's friend brought over a small, well-worn book, a poetry collection that had been passed down through generations. She shared the lines with the young woman, who, despite her initial disinterest, found herself intrigued by the beautiful words that captured feelings she had long buried. They would sit together for hours, reading passages out loud, analyzing meanings, and sharing their own thoughts on love and life. Slowly, a bridge formed between them, built from the shared experiences of two very different lives that had both felt disconnected at times. It wasn't just the books or the poetry. There was something more. Her mother's friend had an uncanny way of listening. Not just hearing the words, but listening to the silences between them, understanding the unspoken things. The young woman began to realize that her life had been defined by this quiet emptiness. She was always surrounded by people, but never truly heard asterisk. But with her mother's friend, it was different. She felt seen, in a way that she hadn't before. There were moments when her heart felt heavy, moments when she was unsure of where her life was headed, of what she truly wanted. And in those moments, the woman was there. She would offer gentle words of reassurance, her hand placed lightly on her shoulder, as though to say, "You're not alone. I see you. I understand." Asterisk. The young woman hadn't realized how much she needed that until now. But with every passing day, the young woman found herself feeling something more than gratitude, more than friendship. It was subtle at first, a glance that lingered a little too long, a touch that felt more intimate than it should have. Her heart started to beat faster when her mother's friend was near, and she found herself looking forward to her visits in a way that went beyond the comfort of shared conversation. Her mind raced with thoughts she didn't understand. Was this just a fleeting feeling? Or was it something more? It was impossible to ignore, and yet, impossible to fully understand. She fought the growing connection. She told herself that it was just admiration, just a natural bond between two people who understood each other. But the more she tried to convince herself, the stronger the pull became. As the days passed, the young woman found herself questioning everything. She was torn between the comfort she felt when she was with her mother's friend and the guilt that followed whenever her thoughts strayed too far. Was this normal? Asterisk. Her mother's friend had always been a part of her life, a constant figure from her childhood. She had always been there for her mother, but now, it felt different. There was no denying that something had shifted. And as much as the young woman tried to dismiss it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something that could change everything. The confusion mixed with a strange sense of excitement, a fear of what this meant, yet an undeniable curiosity. She wasn't ready to confront it, not yet. But she knew deep down that the connection was growing stronger, and sooner or later, it would have to be addressed. One evening, as the young woman and her mother's friend sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, their conversation took a turn. They began talking about their childhoods, the struggles, the losses, the dreams they once had. The wind blew softly around them, carrying away the weight of their words, leaving only the connection between them. Her mother's friend looked at her, her eyes soft and understanding, and in that moment, everything changed. The young woman felt a warmth spread through her chest, an emotion she hadn't been prepared for. Her mother's friend smiled faintly and said, "You've always been so full of potential. I see you in a way no one else does. And it's beautiful." Asterisk. That was it. In those few words, the young woman felt seen, not just as the quiet, overlooked girl she had always been, but as someone with worth, with depth. For a brief moment, the world outside of their small bubble didn't matter. It was just them, two souls that had somehow found each other in a world full of noise. And for the first time in a long time, the young woman felt truly alive. The connection between them had only just begun, and with it came the promise of something more, something that neither of them could escape. The days that followed felt different. Every interaction with her mother's friend seemed charged with a new energy, an undercurrent of something neither of them could ignore. The young woman tried to convince herself that it was just the poetry, the deep conversations, they had always shared these moments, hadn't they? But this time, it felt more intense. Her heart fluttered every time her mother's friend entered the room. It wasn't just her presence anymore, it was the way she looked at her, the way her smile seemed to hold a world of understanding that no one else had ever given her. The way her voice would soften when they spoke, as though her words were meant for her alone. The young woman tried to keep her feelings in check. She buried them deep inside, telling herself it was nothing more than the closeness they had developed. But every time their hands brushed, every time her mother's friend's gaze lingered just a second too long, it became harder to deny. One evening, they were sitting in the living room, the soft light from the lamp casting shadows on the walls. They talked about everything and nothing, life, love, the future. And yet, with every passing word, the young woman felt herself drawn to her more than ever before. Her heart raced as the conversation shifted, as her mother's friend leaned a little closer, as their eyes met and held for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She could feel it, the unspoken connection, the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. And then, without thinking, the young woman did something she would never have dared to do before. She reached out, her fingers brushing against her mother's friend's hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock through her. Her mother's friend didn't pull away. Instead, she held her gaze, as if waiting for the young woman to say something, to explain the feeling that hung in the air. But there were no words. There didn't need to be. They sat like that for a moment, their hands barely touching, but the connection between them was undeniable. The young woman's breath caught in her throat as her mother's friend gently squeezed her hand. It was an innocent gesture, yet it felt like a promise. In that moment, everything shifted. The young woman's world tilted slightly, as though the ground beneath her was no longer solid. She pulled her hand away quickly, as if to deny what had just happened. But the feeling lingered, the warmth of her mother's friend's touch still tingled on her skin, and the young woman couldn't help but feel like something had just begun, a story that had no clear ending but one that she couldn't turn away from. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a mistake, a fleeting moment, or was there something more? For days, the young woman avoided her mother's friend, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to face her after that touch. But every time they crossed paths, it became harder to ignore the pull between them. Her mother's friend seemed to know something was wrong, her eyes always searching for something the young woman wasn't ready to confront. Then, one evening, when they were sitting on the porch again, watching the sunset, her mother's friend finally broke the silence. You've been distant, she said quietly, her voice soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. What's going on, my dear? The young woman hesitated. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm confused. About everything. About you. About me. Her mother's friend remained silent for a moment, her gaze steady but gentle. It's okay to be confused. You're not the only one. The words hung in the air between them, and the young woman felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the only one feeling something she didn't fully understand. Her mother's friend reached over, her hand resting lightly on the young woman's, the touch familiar and comforting. Whatever it is you're feeling, you don't have to face it alone. We'll figure it out together. The young woman felt a surge of relief and fear all at once. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't drowning in her confusion. She wasn't lost anymore. She had someone who understood, someone who saw her in a way no one else ever had. They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the evening surrounding them. The young woman didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where this connection with her mother's friend would lead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. And in that moment, she realized something important. The confusion, the uncertainty, it was part of the journey. And maybe, just maybe, it was a journey she wasn't meant to take alone. As they sat there together, the young woman felt a quiet sense of peace settle in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The next chapter in her life was about to begin, and it was more than just a story of love. It was a story of self-discovery, of finding a connection that was deeper than anything she had ever known. And no matter where it would lead, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The days after that conversation were quieter, but no less intense. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling of her mother's friend's touch lingering on her skin, nor the way her words had settled in her heart. We'll figure it out together. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. How much she had been craving reassurance, someone to help guide her through the storm of emotions she had no words for. But now that the words had been spoken, there was no going back. She could feel the path ahead of her unfolding, though she had no idea where it would lead. Her interactions with her mother's friend had shifted, though neither of them addressed the underlying tension directly. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the connection that had grown too strong to ignore. Yet, there was still an unspoken barrier, a line neither of them dared to cross just yet. The young woman often caught herself watching her mother's friend when she thought she wasn't looking. She would find herself memorizing the small details, the way her fingers gently tapped on the table when she spoke, the softness in her eyes when she smiled. The attraction was undeniable, but so was the fear. The fear of what it would mean if they let it go any further, of what might happen to their relationship, to her life, to everything they knew. One evening, after dinner, the young woman found herself sitting with her mother's friend on the porch again, the fading light casting long shadows. The quiet seemed heavier this time, more filled with expectation. Neither of them spoke immediately, each waiting for the other to say something. Finally, her mother's friend broke the silence, her voice soft but certain. I think we both know what this is, she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The young woman felt her heart skip a beat. The weight of the moment hung heavy between them, and she struggled to find the right words. What do you mean? She asked, though she knew exactly what her mother's friend was referring to. Her mother's friend turned to face her, her expression unreadable. I don't know what you're feeling, but I can't deny what I feel. And I know it's complicated. The young woman's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, to explain how her heart had been racing, how she had never felt this way before, but she couldn't find the words. She was afraid that if she spoke the truth, everything would change forever, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Her mother's friend leaned forward, her eyes searching the young woman's face. You don't have to say anything. I just want you to know that I'm here. No matter what happens, we'll face it together. The warmth in her voice was both comforting and terrifying. The young woman wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that no matter where this led, they could navigate it together. But deep down, she feared that what they were feeling was too powerful, too dangerous to ignore. There was a long silence as they sat together, the evening air cool against their skin. The young woman's mind raced with the possibilities, but there was one thing she couldn't deny. She had never felt more alive than she did in this moment, sitting next to someone who made her feel understood in ways no one else ever had. The next few days passed in a blur. The young woman found herself walking a tightrope, constantly aware of the unspoken tension between her and her mother's friend. She couldn't look at her without feeling a rush of emotions, a confusing mix of excitement, longing, and fear. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something too powerful to control, and the only question was whether they would take that final step or pull back. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon, when the world outside seemed to mirror her internal chaos, that the young woman found herself sitting alone in the living room, staring out the window. The soft patter of rain against the glass seemed to calm her racing thoughts, but she still couldn't shake the overwhelming feelings that had consumed her since that moment on the porch. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. She had to face it, whatever it was. She needed answers, even if those answers came at a cost. Her heart pounded in her chest when the door opened, and she saw her mother's friend step inside, shaking off the rain. The familiar feeling of warmth flooded her chest, and before she could stop herself, she stood up and walked toward her. "I need to talk," the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's friend looked up at her, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know, we both do." They sat down on the couch together, the space between them charged with the weight of unspoken words. The young woman took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel it. Like I'm not falling for you." Her mother's friend didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on the young woman's. Her touch was gentle, reassuring, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something the young woman couldn't quite place. "I don't know what to do with this, either," her mother's friend admitted, her voice low. "But I care about you. I have for a long time." The young woman's heart raced, the words filling her with a mix of relief and fear. She had said it aloud, admitted it to herself, and now, there was no going back. "I don't want to lose you," the young woman whispered. Her mother's friend squeezed her hand. "You won't. No matter what happens, you won't lose me. But we need to figure out where this goes. Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, the young woman allowed herself to believe it. There was a way forward. There was a way to face the future, no matter how complicated it might be. And for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. The rain outside seemed to quiet, the storm passing, leaving only the two of them in the calm. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they were in this together. And that, for the young woman, was enough.